Hey guys, welcome back. This is Dave Cummings from Point Loma Nazarene. This is the second video in a 5-part series on cellular communication. In the first video, we just gave kind of the big picture concept of what it means for a cell to receive a signal and respond to it. And then we described the most basic form of cell communication, which is cellular adaptation. What I want to do in this video is first start off with an example of cell-to-cell communication in a multicellular organism, and then we'll look at 5 different common ways, sometimes referred to as models, that cells within a multicellular organism can communicate with one another. So let's go ahead and get started. So in this particular example of cell-to-cell communication, we're looking at plants, many of which can follow the track of the sun as the sun moves across the sky during the day in order to maximize the incident light that hits them and therefore maximize their photosynthesis. We call this phototropism. And so what you see here in this picture is we've got the growing tip of a plant, and the cells near the very tip, that growing region there, have the potential to produce a communication molecule, a signal called auxin. Auxin then is sent to, right along here you can see it's sent to the cells that are distant from the light. And what that does is they receive that signal and they respond by elongating, not by carrying out mitosis, but elongating. And so the same number of cells, the same space, but they're elongating, and as you can see in the image here, it causes them to bend towards the source of the light. So these cells here are on the quote-unquote dark side of the shoot, and therefore it causes bending towards, pointing towards the actual light, phototropism. So the movement of a portion of a plant so that the plant actually follows light. And it all comes down to one cell type at the tip here producing a signaling molecule called auxin, and then another cell type along the dark side of the plant structure here that can receive and respond to the auxin. And then the ultimate response is for the whole plant to be able to maximize the incident light that it captures and maximize its photosynthesis. So what are the different ways that cells within a multicellular organism can communicate with each other? How can, for example, the human brain release a hormone, and hormones are simply long-distance communication molecules? How can it release a hormone from the brain that then acts on the heart, right? That's, 18 inches away in an adult, something like that. What are the different ways that this can take place? Okay, 5 models. A model is just sort of a large, complex concept of cell-to-cell communication. You see in the upper left, we've got direct intercellular signaling. Direct because the cells are in contact with each other. Intercellular meaning from one cell to the next. In B, we've got contact-dependent signaling, where one cell literally delivers the signal on its surface to the cell that has the receptor, the target cell. And then we have 3 that have the CRINE suffix to it. We've got autocrine signaling, paracrine signaling, and endocrine signaling. So let's look at each of these 5 in a little more detail with some examples as well that'll hopefully help bring it home for you. So here's an example of direct intercellular signaling in the human heart, also in muscle tissue, very important, where you've got cells that are tightly packed next to one another in a tissue, and they have a particular type of connection between them called a gap junction. That gap junction then allows a small dissolved signal, something like an ion, for example, to diffuse from one cell across the gap junction into the cytoplasm of the receiving cell. The 2 protein channels, if you will, that come together are referred to as a connexon. So this connexon then allows the movement, the passage of these small solutes from the cytoplasm of one into the cytoplasm of the other, and this allows for example, the coordinated muscle contractions in the various portions of the heart, or the coordinated waving of cilia in the respiratory tract, in the ciliary ladder. Direct intercellular signaling. Inter means between. So this is direct because they're in contact with each other. Intercellular, from one to the next signaling. Okay, another example, and I want you to try to tease apart which of those 5 types I showed you we see here. This comes from the immune system. So imagine this purple oval is a specialized white blood cell called an antigen-presenting cell. We'll pretend it's a macrophage, which is one of the white blood cells that's important in detecting and then killing foreign objects, foreign particles, and organisms that get inside the human body. When an antigen-presenting cell, like a macrophage, consumes and kills through phagocytosis a pathogen, rather than just sort of dumping all of the fragments after it's digested, there are a lot of fragments left, out into the environment, instead it can take these antigens, abbreviated AG, put them on the surface of a protein that's on the surface of the cell called major histocompatibility complex, and display the antigen. So the antigen becomes the signal. The antigen is the signal. Now, who is this signaling to? Well, another white blood cell called a helper T cell. And helper T cells have specialized receptors on their surface that allow them to recognize antigen being presented to them on the surface of these macrophages. So our receptors, this helper T cell receptor on the surface of the helper T cell. The signal is this antigen being displayed, held by an MHC protein being displayed on the surface of an antigen-presenting cell. Now, interestingly, when you get this connection, when the helper T cell recognizes an antigen being presented to it, the helper T cell responds by producing cytokines. Cytokines are cell-to-cell communication molecules. So the antigen was a signal. These cytokines are also signals that help to coordinate the immune response. Some of these cytokines will actually bind to cytokine receptors on the helper T cell. Some cytokines will bind to cytokine receptors on the antigen-presenting cell, and others will diffuse away and interact with other cell types that are out there. So my question to you is this contact-dependent signaling? Or is this autocrine signaling? Is it possibly both? Contact-dependent signaling happens when the signal molecule is actually bound to the surface of a presenting cell, and the receiving cell has its receptor on its surface. So the signal actually gets sort of personally delivered directly to the cell that's going to receive it. We call that contact-dependent signaling. But the cell response for the helper T cell was to produce cytokines, more signaling molecules, some of which will bind right back to the very same cell that produced them, in which case it's what we call autocrine signaling, a sort of talking to yourself model of cellular signaling. So here, in one very important human example, we've got 2 different types of signaling taking place, both contact-dependent and autocrine signaling. What else? So, for example, here is a nerve cell, and this nerve cell has to receive signals here in what are called the dendrites, relay the signal as a change in electrochemical potential across the membrane, going all the way down the axon. And at the axon terminals, it needs to respond by releasing short-lived neurotransmitters. And those short-lived neurotransmitters are only going to be picked up by the next set of dendrites that are sort of intertwined with these axons here. In other words, they're going to move very short distance and be very short-lived. What kind of signaling is that? It's not direct intercellular signaling. It's not contact dependent, because one cell isn't touching the other and the signal isn't somehow bound to the membrane of the delivering cell. It's not autocrine because it's not communicating with itself. This is an example of paracrine signaling, where the signal is released by one cell type here, travels a very, very short distance to the dendrites of the next cell that are entangled within it. Paracrine signaling, we have a whole paracrine system. So this is paracrine signaling, where cells release signals that only affect cells that are very close by. They don't travel very long distances. Now, the signaling that you've probably heard all about is the endocrine signaling system, where, in this case, we've got communication molecules, which in the endocrine system are referred to as hormones. We have communication molecules that can travel very long distances. They don't have to just interact with cells adjacent to them like we saw in the paracrine system. So, for example, in the brain, the hypothalamus or the pineal gland or the pituitary gland can produce a wide range of hormones that then are distributed through the body, and only cells that have those receptors will respond to those. Thyroid does the same thing, releases things like thyroxine, right? So another example, T3, which is thyroid hormone 3. It regulates your basal metabolic rate, your heart rate, and your adrenaline. But it's coming from the thyroid up here, wrapped around your trachea. And then it regulates your heart rate, your basal metabolic rate, as well as your adrenaline that's being released, which is coming from your adrenal glands, right, which are attached to the kidneys. Adrenal, they're on top of the kidneys. So when we're talking about the endocrine system, we're talking about the signals moving a long distance, typically by way of the bloodstream. And I'll just make this comment that hormones are either proteins or they're lipids, typically. Now, there are some amine hormones as well that have an amino group as their primary functional group, but most of them are going to be proteins or they're going to be lipids. Take, for example, testosterone. That is a lipid, right, modified version of cholesterol, versus this T3, which is a protein. And there are some amines that you can learn about, especially that have to do with things like fight or flight response and so on, that the brain in particular can release. So, in summary, there are 5 main ways that the human body or any large multicellular organism might be able to coordinate its cells to communicate with one another in order to behave as a single unit rather than a collection of independent cells. So I hope that was helpful. If that was at all confusing, it's a video. Go back, hit pause, take notes, think it through, ask questions, compare it to your textbook, and bring questions to class, whether you're in my class or in someone else's. Bring questions to class that you can ask so that we can clarify for you. Thanks.